In this video, I want to discuss the concept of resurrection, or what it really means to be born again, at least from the perspective of somebody pursuing a mystical path. Around the time of Lent and Easter, people who are devoted to following a mystical path will choose things that they're trying to get rid of and behaviors they're trying to take on. And for the 6 weeks of Lent, or however many days, approximately 40 days of Lent, leading up to Holy Week and then coming to a climax on Easter Sunday, the goal is to discipline ourselves, to learn to let go of certain things or take on certain things, and receive the supernatural help at this time of year that allows us to have the strength to reach a new understanding, to reach a new level. And that level is, it is possible to live without these certain indulgences, without these certain addictive behaviors, without these certain behaviors that I know keep me separated from my highest nature, ultimately that keep me separate from being in complete union with the Christ within. And then it culminates, at least in the mystical path, to a few days of fasting, usually Good Friday and Holy Saturday, and in some cases even Maundy Thursday, up to 3 days of fasting, and then there's Easter Sunday. And Easter Sunday is the celebration of the resurrection of the crucified man Jesus, who comes back into life in a resurrected body. Now this is symbolic of the death of an old aspect of oneself and a resurrection into a new, well, that's the mystery. What is it that is resurrected? When people talk about being born again Christian, at least before I was on the spiritual path, I was always somewhat mystified. Well, what does it mean? And in John chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus and says, how is it possible to be born again? I mean, are you supposed to re-enter the mother's womb and then be physically born again? And it's a genuine question, even though, I don't think anybody expects the answer is yes, that's what you're supposed to do. There's a mystery to it. What does it mean to be born again? For this video, I want to equate the idea of being resurrected and the idea of being born again is essentially the same thing. So the question is, what aspect of oneself is born again? Well, clearly it's not the flesh body, because the flesh body does not die and then come alive again. The case with Jesus, it did because it was symbolic. It was showing us that something has to die, and then that very same thing is reborn, but in a new state. And for our purposes, what actually is born again, or what is resurrected, is a new understanding, a new consciousness. And what does that mean? Well, we are all at a certain level of consciousness. And the word conscious means to be aware of. So you may recognize that many people in the Bible, as Jesus is moving through his 3 years of ministry, are healed of their blindness. And they are able to see. And inwardly, this represents a shift in consciousness. That at a certain level of consciousness, you're blind to greater spiritual truths. And through your relationship with Christ, this inner part of you, this mysterious God self, your sight becomes opened, you're able to see things, and therefore you become conscious of new truths and new realities. You could look at that in the context of relationship. Let's take, for example, somebody who's 16 years old and has never been in a romantic relationship, has a real strong crush on some girl at school. And his consciousness about what a relationship can be and is, and the pitfalls and the wonderful exchanges and all that, is relatively limited, probably by what he's read and what he's seen on movies and what his friends have talked about. But let's say he asks this girl out, and she likes him, and they begin a romantic relationship. As a result of living that romantic relationship, his consciousness about romance greatly increases because of the experience, because he now knows what it's like to be in a relationship. And let's say for some reason that relationship falls apart. So consciousness also shifts because now the person becomes aware of what it's like to either be heartbroken or to realize they've fallen out of love with the person. And so the consciousness grows and shifts with the experiences that you have. The same is true of business. If you're somebody who's worked for many years for other people and you have a consciousness of what it's like to be a good employee, but you've saved money and you have an idea and you decide to pursue it, and you step into this realm of business owner, your consciousness will change as you become aware of what it's like to assume those risks and hire people and carry the proper insurances and deal with landlords or be a property owner and deal with clients and the challenges and the successes that that brings. And maybe after a few years of succeeding in business, your consciousness of yourself as a business owner is way beyond where it was before. And it's very common for people who go through that to say, man, when I first started my business, I was really blind. I was really blinded by my ambition. I thought that it was going to work out like this, and I figured people would love my product or my service, and it really didn't go that way. I had to make these changes. I had to, be flexible. And all of that has an effect on our consciousness. So then when somebody who's just looking to start off in business goes to talk to somebody who's been doing businesses for 30 years, often that more experienced person is bringing a wisdom that's trying to open the sight of the younger person. And this is really what we are aspiring for on the spiritual path. We are looking to Jesus as the example of somebody who has this tremendous spiritual consciousness, this awareness of truth at the highest level that a human being can have. And we are asking that he may open our sight so that we can see the truth. In fact, we are looking to his life to find out, how do we get to the Christ within? How do we explore the kingdom of heaven? What do we have to let go in order to have it? What do we have to take on in order to know it? And we humbly go, I guess I'm fairly blind because I don't know what to do in these situations. Or, I can recite scripture and I understand to a certain degree why Jesus came and why he had to die, but the experience of knowing truth and being unhinged from these wounds and these concepts and these ideas of the past that have hindered me, that have pained me, that have held me back. When we really begin the mystical path, we can't see all that stuff. So every year we take on practices in Lent, and we strive to starve those parts of us that keep us separate from God. Let's say people give up alcohol for Lent. And what they're trying to do, really, if you follow the true meaning of Lent, at least from my perspective, is we are teaching our bodies and our minds and our emotions what it's like to live either without any alcohol or at a much more moderate usage. And some people, the day after Easter, or even on Easter, they can't wait to start drinking again. So there's somewhat of a cultural idea that you give up things for Lent and then after Easter you start up again. What we teach is that you give things up and you struggle through the pain of that and you suffer a little bit, and then come Easter, you realize that you have a different consciousness, that you don't need the alcohol, or you don't need the sweets, or you don't need to be swearing all the time, or you don't need to be indulging in whatever it is that you're doing. That you have seen yourself through the difficulty, through the discipline, you have seen yourself be able to live without these things. You have turned to God in those times of discomfort, and you have seen that God has carried you through. So now your consciousness is born anew. And what that means is that you now have a new awareness that it is possible to live without those things that you were so dependent on in the past. Now you could say, well, that sounds good, but that's it? That's born again? That's what it means to be a born again Christian? When you walk the mystical path, every year you go through these same patterns. And every year during Lent, we seek to get more subtle in the things that we give up. We seek to be born again every year, to be resurrected every Easter into a new consciousness. And that consciousness is more and more free of the worldly ways of taking comfort at the expense of making room for God. and living where we are completely dependent upon every word that we hear from within. Every thought that we make and every word that we utter falls into this category of being within the Christ consciousness. That's our goal. Now, this year in particular, I wanted to talk about being born into the consciousness of love, because it is somewhat painful for me as I move through the world to recognize how much distinction people see in myself and other people based on criteria that are really very superficial. The most obvious, of course, is men and women. Men speak about women sometimes very positively, sometimes very negatively, and women do the same. There's criticisms that each has towards each other. And there's a sense of, there's a battle. It's like the battle of the sexes, as they used to say in those TV shows. So, to a certain degree, the men and the women become enemies to each other because the women would like the men to be more this way, and the men would like the women to be more this way, so that it would be easier for each other. What we teach is that we are all brothers and sisters. We are all actually souls, and that the soul does not really permanently take on the gender of this particular lifetime. So really, every human being walking around the planet is a soul who has Christ within them. And you could call it the God self or the self, or in other religions and spiritual paths they may have a different term for it. But essentially all mystical paths teach that there is this presence within, this high presence of God. And so beginning to recognize that no matter how much you dislike the outer version of the person, their gender or their race or their way of speaking or their attitude, that there is no getting away from the idea that they have a soul and they have a God self. So we talked about the gender as a very noticeable difference between myself and this woman, or this woman and this man. And that's caused to create separation. Another very obvious thing is, well, the people in my family, my wife, my brother, my dad, my kids, my grandparents, my cousins, the farther we get away from the immediate, as they call nuclear family, to a certain degree, the more gray it gets. But when it comes to my family, I'll do anything for my kids and my wife. And I have this idea that that's my family, and people who are outside of my family potentially represent a threat to my family. Such that, in America, people are very adamant that they want to carry guns because they have to protect the people who they love. From my perspective, we are all in this one family. We are brothers and sisters of our great Father, Mother, God, the Creator. And the consciousness of love that I'm asking you to be born again into is to really strive to understand that and put it into practice. That just because this guy wears a turban, or just because this guy's decked out in kind of a rap outfit and looks like is dangerous, or just because this guy is Asian and in computer science, or just because this woman is overweight, or this guy has a bad haircut, or this guy's got bad teeth, or whatever it is, whatever aspect that I look at the person and I go, I don't like him, I don't trust him, I don't want him around me, I don't like the way they live, I don't like the smell in their house, I don't like the way they talk, I don't like their accent, I don't like their language, I don't like all these things. This is a consciousness of separation. This is a consciousness of looking at human beings and determining that they are different than me and potentially a threat to me. And that is not true, actually. That is a level of consciousness that is ignorant of the truth. The truth is that, yes, culturally, people are very different. And people in a Caucasian culture versus people in an African American culture, there's a curiosity. Oh, you do it this way, we do it this way. We eat these kind of foods, you eat these kind of foods. This is what you like to do when you hang out with your family. This is what we like to do when we hang out with our family. Or, go to Norway, or go to Iceland, or go to India, or go to New Zealand. Just because of the geography and because of the culture, people do things differently. And, let's face it, it can be a little bit uncomfortable when a lot of stuff is radically different. And maybe you don't agree with why. For example, I may not totally understand, why does somebody wear a turban? Or why does somebody just perpetually grow a really long beard? I might go, not very practical for the way I live. For me to condemn that person and look at them and go, well, because of their beard and because they call themselves a Muslim, I have the right to exclude them from this consciousness of love and say, you are a threat to me. Now, okay, there are Muslims, or we don't even know if they're Muslims, but there are people who fall into this category who want to terrorize other people. And in America these days, we have a certain sector of the population that has determined that Muslim basically equals terrorist, and therefore we have to exclude all Muslims from the freedoms that this country allows. And that is a consciousness of ignorance. It's not true. In fact, forget the Muslim thing and forget the terrorist thing. It doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or a terrorist or you're a Christian or you're Jewish or you're Taoist or you have no religion or you hate God. It doesn't matter. You still have a soul and you still have the presence, this high presence of God within you. There's no escaping that. I mean, I'm going to be very adamant about that. I don't mind if people have a different opinion. I'm willing to talk about it. But that much I am going to stand firm and say, we all have a soul. That soul is eternal. We also have this presence of God within, call it the God Self, or the Self, capital S, or the Christ. And our jobs as mystics is to find that consciousness and allow that consciousness to essentially take over our lives. So the consciousness of separation, the consciousness of ego, the consciousness of I don't like this person, and I don't like their family, and I don't like their culture, and I don't like the color of their skin, and I don't like how poor they are, and I don't like how they speak, and all that, that is not the consciousness of Christ. That is the consciousness of ego and fear and anxiety and I want to succeed and I don't like these people and all that stuff. That is a consciousness of separation. And it has led to, because it's so prominent and because our media, essentially accentuates it, and our movies and our books and entertainment all highlight the differences between each other. Not all of it, of course, there's some good stuff. But because that consciousness is so prevalent, we have a world that is essentially at war with each other. And from my perspective, it doesn't make sense. We're all people, and we all have this desire to be loved, to be purposeful in our lives, to enjoy the fruits of the earth, this amazing planet that has incredible fruits and vegetables and animals and options and choices, and there's just so many great things that one could do on this earth. And yet we spend so much time in conflict, creating these huge military forces to protect us against our own people, against human beings who have souls, who have God, who have families, who have kids, who have needs, who have desires and hopes and aspirations. I mean, remember that. Everybody who's on the opposite end of, in your mind, who's on behind enemy lines, has the same desires for love and connection that you do. It's just that a consciousness exists on the earth whereby it is justified to hate people. I mean, how does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense. However, it's so universally accepted that people think it's okay. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think it's okay. I mean, it's okay in the sense that we have choice, we have free will, so if we want to think that way, we can. But I want you to be born again on the level of consciousness into this idea that all human beings on this planet are related to me on this spiritual level. That we are all brothers and sisters, and we all have a backstory. And everybody started off newly born and totally helpless and generally quite innocent. I mean, there's varying approaches to that as far as karma and the stuff that's on your soul as you carry from one life to the other. I don't want to get into that in this video, but maybe in a future video. But if you could watch even the most despicable person, and you could watch their life, watch a movie of it and see where the influences in their life started to steer them towards negativity, where they were denied love, where they decided to follow influences that were dark and separated, or just the terrible abuses that they went through that that taught them that the only way to survive is to become powerful and abusive. I mean, everybody's story will make sense to you. And it will be very difficult to sustain the idea that these people are despicable and they should be put to death and they should be, essentially excluded. I'm not saying we are meant to hang out with everybody and be friends with everybody, because being friends with people and hanging out with them requires a connection and a certain ease and a certain shared system of values. And different cultures have different values, and it's a beautiful thing on the earth to recognize that and celebrate that. Even sometimes just the aspect of language makes it really hard to connect with people. If you've ever traveled and your first language is English and their, let's say you have a shared language, you both have a second language that's, let's say, Spanish. So you have a person from Africa who speaks a little Spanish and you speak a little Spanish. And then you're trying to connect. I mean, you see how difficult it is without the fluency of language. And yet there's a beauty in it in just trying to find common ground through the limited vocabulary that you have. It's kind of cool. So to conclude this video, I want to encourage you, as Easter unfolds and the spring really takes off, to challenge yourself to move into this consciousness of love, to begin to see everybody as human beings, regardless of their gender, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their education, regardless of their income, regardless of their race. They are human beings, and all human beings essentially, at the core level, want the same things. They want to be loved. They want the opportunity to live a free life. They want the opportunity to succeed. And ultimately, I think they want purpose. They want their life to be meaningful. And every human being has that somewhere inside. Some people are so badly wounded, they can barely get out of bed. So seek to have this consciousness. Seek to accept everybody, that nobody is your enemy. Okay, if people want to hurt you, you may have to keep up a boundary. But if everybody on the planet was to get rid of this idea that we have enemies, and that these people are bad and these people are good and these people are my friends, but the rest of them I have to guard against, that it wouldn't take that long before there would be no need for armies. We would just be able to communicate about our differences and resolve them, which I absolutely believe is possible. The fact that we have this sophisticated way of communicating that blows any animal away. I mean, I'm sure animals have sophisticated ways of communicating, at least within their own groupings. But really, if you study animals, I mean, they don't create societies and buildings and technology the way that we do. We have the ability to do things, to create, that's far beyond what the animals do. And so let's honor that, and let's be enamored with the aspect of a human being. And let's strive to understand, what does it mean to be a soul, and what are the freedoms that I have, and how do I develop this ability to create with great ease? I tell you, if we can take the pressure off of hating each other and stop wasting so much energy building up defenses against each other, we have a real shot of the beauty of what it means to be on the earth and be in harmony with ourselves, with our neighbor, and ultimately with our Creator.